It's a beautiful day out there. Time to explore. Hey everybody, Melanie and I were recently boondocking in the Chiricahua wilderness in southeast Arizona, and one day we decided to take a tour of Faraway Ranch, which is up in Chiricahua National Monument. And I'll drop in a card somewhere up here for the video of that tour. And as we were walking around, came upon this sad looking tree. I don't know how well it was doing. And below it was the marker that you saw in the thumbnail about the lost ranger. Didn't contain too much information, just some dates and a picture of somebody sitting on a horse, or an outline of somebody sitting on the horse. So I don't know. A person like me, I'm an academic, I teach college, I do research, I'm inquisitive. So when we got back to Tucson, I just had to find out who was this lost ranger by the name of Paul Braxton Fugate. And this is what I found out, and I wanted to share it with you. Now, be forewarned. I have a teleprompter, I have a script. I am atrocious at a teleprompter. So please forgive if look like I'm just sitting here reading, which I'll be doing. But I do want to tell you the story because I found it very interesting, and I hope you will too. And it goes back to January 13th, 1980. At 2 p.m. that day, Park Ranger Paul Fugate, the only member of the permanent staff on duty that day, walked out of his office to check out a nature trail. He left instructions with the only other person, a seasonal employee, that if he was not back by 4:30 to begin to shut down the office without him. He appeared to walk down towards the Chiricahua National Monument entrance and was never seen again. No trace of the ranger was ever found, despite extensive searches by the National Park Service, the Cochise County Sheriff's Department, the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Forest Service, the Southern Arizona Search and Rescue Association, Customs, the Border Patrol, and Fugate's many friends. And I just want to note here, if I forget later on, Paul is the only Park Service employee not to be accounted for. I'm sure, I haven't looked up numbers, but some had to get lost but were found. Some may have fell and died, were found, attacked by whatever story, but they've all been accounted for except Paul. And here's how the story kind of goes. At the time, his wife Dodie lived in Tucson, about 2 hours west of the Chiricahuas, while Paul lived at the monument in a Spartan cobblestone cabin where he might stay for a couple of weeks at a stretch. He had a guest visiting him that weekend and started the day by driving his guest up to Massey Point so they could hike down to the visitor center. And I don't have a video for it, but it's a very nice hike if you're ever in Chiricahua. The Park Service will actually drive you up there so you can walk down and not have to worry about your car. And he told his house guest that if he wasn't back by a certain time, please notify somebody. Always smart to do. I know every time we go hiking in a national park or monument, we always stop in the visitor centers, talk to a ranger, said, hey, that's our truck, this is where we're going, this is who we are. If you have to drive up there tomorrow and the truck's still there, please look for us. So when he didn't show back up at about 10 p.m., she notified Ted Scott, the monument superintendent, who rounded up two colleagues, set out with flashlight, trudging through the surrounding canyons, calling Paul's name the whole way. No luck. The next morning, Scott contacted the Cochise Sheriff's Office, which sent in a search and rescue team, total of 22 men and women on the ground, plus one dog. By Tuesday afternoon, the National Guard had a helicopter overhead, and 16 volunteers from the Southern Arizona Rescue Association bedded down at the visitor center. They scrambled over rocky ledges, rappelled into the impassable Oregon Pipe Formation. They found some footprints, but realized they were from a searcher coming up from below. They moved in a long line like a string of Boy Scouts cleaning up a campground. They scoured almost everything within a half a mile of the visitor center. The official search lasted just over 2 weeks, but Dodie, his wife, marshaled groups of volunteers who over the next several years walked the trails, checked abandoned mines, and otherwise hunted for traces of the missing ranger. Dodie and the volunteers held benefit concerts and badgered Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater to get involved. There were purported sightings trickled in from around the country, from New Mexico, the Florida Keys. None of the tips panned out. And eventually, the Park Service officials determined that Paul was nowhere on the 18 square miles of Chiricahua National Monument. So what happened to Paul? There's much speculation, and I really do not want to get into all the possible theories of what may have happened to Paul. I'd rather make this video more of a memorial on who Paul was rather than what happened to Paul. So who was Paul? Who was Dodie, his wife? Paul Braxton Fugate was born in Brooklyn, New York on September 2nd, 1938, the first of 3 sons and 3 daughters. When World War II broke out, Paul's parents returned to their home state of Texas and moved into a wood-shingled 2-bedroom house in Fort Worth. As a teenager, Paul grew Jurassic-sized castor bean plants in the backyard and tamed a crow, which would skin rats near the kitchen window and dive bomb a neighbor's shiny bald head. So far, sounds good. Paul's father, Braxton, was a sheet metal worker for a predecessor of Lockheed Martin and earned side money doing taxes. He was a hard ass, originally enforcing rules that Paul had little use for. In our family, you didn't fight, says his younger sister, Monette. You got those really straight white lips and walked away. Later, Paul learned how to stand his ground, refusing to sign a loyalty oath in college and protesting the Vietnam War. Dodie, whose legal name is Mary Ann, got to know the Fugate girls when they were all Girl Scouts together. She was an only child, the daughter of a railroad worker in southern New Mexico. I lived a lot of my life on the edge of nowhere, she told someone. Her family moved to the outskirts of Fort Worth in 1948. She and Monette both ended up at the University of Texas in Austin. Back from college in the summer of 1962, Dodie stopped by the Fugate house. While her friends exchanged dance tips, she wandered into the dining room and saw a guy with a crew cut and Buddy Holly glasses. Paul launched into a bizarre lecture about Inuits, then asked if she wanted to see his gun. Of course she did. I guess it was a different time. She was on the women's shooting team at what was then Arlington State College, now University of Texas, Arlington. That night she told the Fugate girls she was going to marry Paul. Oh my God, don't do that, Paul's sister Linda said. He's weird. Some may call him weird, but I'd rather say Paul just had eclectic interests. But having a career wasn't really one of them. He zigzagged towards a biology degree at Arlington while collecting antique guns, performing quality control work for a flour milling company, and hanging out with newspapermen at the Cellar, a rowdy fixture on the Fort Worth music scene. After graduating in 1963, Paul considered putting his science skills to use at Utah's Dugway Proving Ground, an Army test site for biological and chemical weapons, but decided to apply to the National Park Service instead. Paul and Dodie were married on December 11, 1964, and 5 months later he went to work at Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico, where visitors were enthralled by his sunset talks. Next, the Fugates were stationed at the sandstone canyons of Arizona's Navajo National Monument, home of the Bedakin cliff dwellings. We were just in ecstasy, Dodie said. Well, best to think of, I think, Paul as a 1960s hippie. They were almost in ecstasy. Paul quite didn't like being bossed around by the monument superintendent, Jack Williams, who he derided as Smoky Pig. He and another employee would plink bottles with their rifles and joke about sending Williams tumbling off the cliff on a horse. The disdain was mutual. In a 1967 letter, Williams chastised Paul for his anti-authority streak, his laziness, and his personal appearance. If you want to look and live like a hippie, that is certainly your prerogative. But not here at Navajo National Monument, he wrote. Williams was annoyed that the Park Service just couldn't fire the man. I do not understand the breed now coming into the National Park Service, he wrote to the regional director. So, as the government tends to do, if you can't fire somebody, you transfer them. And just a little more on Paul. Best way to depict him, likable anti-hero, a freewheeling pioneer of the New West. In keeping with his counterculture lifestyle, Paul had started wearing a Fu Manchu mustache, which the Park Service cited as a violation of his grooming standards when he was fired less than a year after his arrival. When he was fired, Paul ended up at the graduate department at the University of Arizona, where he made quite an impression. His supervisor called him one of the finest men it has been my pleasure to work with, and among the top 10 students the department has seen in the past 25 years. After Paul went missing, a classmate named a new plant species in his honor, a flowering desert perennial called Amsonia fugateti. So that's the background of Paul and Dodie. And that's what I think should be remembered. Today, there are still people who are trying to find out what happened, keep looking for clues, basically doing cold case files. You can find him listed on missing person websites. But I would just like to, in this video, to celebrate who Paul was and who Dodie was. Dodie, to this day, I saw in an interview, still keeps a pair of his jeans and a shirt on the dining room table, calling them his civvies when he wasn't out working for the National Park Service. Will we ever know what happened to Paul? Probably not, at least not for sure. But at least we can remember who Paul was and celebrate that life. Now, I'm not going to ask you if you enjoyed this video and just say, I hope you found it interesting. And if you ever get to Faraway Ranch, stop by the memorial, think about Paul. And it almost sounds crass, but subscribe, thumbs up, all that kind of stuff you're used to hearing about. But I do hope you found the video interesting and have yourself a blessed day. Thank you for watching.